Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. In Why We Love Serial Killers, Drew University criminology professor Scott Bonn, Ph.D., simultaneously examines the public's and the media's fascination with the monsters among us, and the fascination in the ways in which that attention impacts them. He writes about serial killers' behaviors and the research, from the FBI's original work to more recent models, that informs the law enforcement professionals charged with profiling, catching, and studying them. A real bonus is Dr. Bond's correspondence with Dennis Rader, BTK, or Bind, Torture, Kill, for its insight into the mind of an especially chilling murderous psychopath. As such, it is a stark reminder that, irrespective of any deceptively benign appearances to the contrary, that they are never like us. The book that is featured this evening is Why We Love Serial Killers, The Curious Appeal of the World's Most Savage Killers, with my special guest, journalist and author and professor, Dr. Scott Bonn. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Dr. Scott Bonn.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's really good to be here, and it's my pleasure. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, thanks very much. And this is, again, I applaud you for something unique in the annals of true crime here, in a book that really looks at how we look at serial killers and how we and why that is. So you've examined many, many important issues with this book, and it's very, very fascinating and a lot of fun, actually, and makes you kind of wonder. So anyway, well, let's get right to this. How much of this phenomena of why we love serial killers, this fascination with serial killers, is an American phenomena? Tell us how American really this whole fascination and the whole serial killer phenomena itself really is.
Well, that's a great question, and if you trace it back to sort of the roots, the first sort of celebrity serial killer, if you will, was probably Jack the Ripper, who of course was in London. So the roots of it really go back to London, and for the sake of your listeners, the reason we can really point to Jack the Ripper is it was the proliferation of broadsheet newspapers that had just recently come on the horizon in major cities like London in the late 19th century. And it was those media vehicles that really propelled Jack the Ripper into the stratosphere in terms of making him a crime celebrity. And but along the same vein, I think the reason that we're so familiar with the Ted Bundys and the Jeffrey Dahmers is because the United States is the media capital of the world. So it's serial killers here who, particularly starting in the 1970s then, really became what I would call celebrity monsters. And actually that's the term that I use in my book to describe these individuals that have been transformed into almost like larger-than-life ghouls, almost like Dracula-like characters.
Right, and you really say that, I'll let you say about what serial killers really represent in society. At one time, there was more, not fairy tales, but tall tales and tales that were passed on from generation to generation, tales of the bogeyman. Tell us what serial killers seem to represent in today's society, like you say, predominantly from the 60s and the 70s in America.
Yeah. Well, in fact, the term serial killer, we believe that it was coined in 1974 by Robert Ressler, the late Robert Ressler, who was one of the premier and original FBI profilers, and he came up with that term based upon using the analogy of serial adventures from the 1940s in movie theaters, The Lone Ranger and Batman and so forth, and he likened serial killers to that because they would just go from one to another, multiple victims, and I would say that these individuals have really become sort of popcorn entertainment in our popular culture. And what I mean by that is the way that they're treated, both real serial killers, the Ted Bundys, the Jeffrey Dahmers, the BTKs, as well as fictional serial killers like Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter, they're almost indistinguishable. They're presented in this highly stylized, larger-than-life fashion. I did an analysis of two leading media vehicles, the New York Times as well as Time Magazine, who are quite prestigious publications. And what I found is that they still would rely on very sensationalized language, typically referring to serial killers as evil, as monsters, devils, vampires, using those sort of terms. Well, those are inhuman terms. And so what tends to happen is these individuals become almost, like Gothic monsters in the popular culture. And, and as such, my argument, or a lot of my the premise of my book is that these individuals become indistinguishable from one another, fact versus fiction. In fact, when Jeffrey Dahmer was caught, he was referred to as the real-life Hannibal Lecter. So there was a blurring of fact and fiction there. And one of my arguments, and here's where I think it does harm to society, Dan, is that when you focus on the serial killers and transform them into these, as I said, sort of Gothic monsters, you lose sight of the victims, and you lose sight of the fact that it's real humans who are being destroyed and lives that are being destroyed here, to the extent that everybody knows the name of Ted Bundy, everybody knows Jeffrey Dahmer, but what about the dozens and dozens of victims? Ted Bundy killed 36 women at least. Can anyone actually recall the name of one of those victims? It's in my experience, very few people can.
Well, I can agree with you, and I see your point, but I was thinking about that after reading your book and then now hearing your response to that as well. But I got to say that I think a fair amount of it is that if you have 33 victims or 49 victims or 17 victims, and the media does what the media does, and you keep playing the name of the perpetrator over and over again, it's just easier to remember the killer. But I think as a real big true crime reader myself, that we empathize with the victims, but just like everyone else who may not even empathize with the victims, and like you talk about, there's a difference between how some people look at the same information in that regard, in that I think that a lot of us really, really empathize with the victim, but we are really, I think, guiltily fascinated with the psychology of why these people are so inhumane or so much on the, again, outer limit of humanity, as you describe in your book as well.
Yes, absolutely, and part of the attraction, part of the morbid fascination with these individuals is the fact that they are larger than life. And one of the analogies that I like to use is, there are people who are fascinated with natural disasters, things like earthquakes, things like avalanches, tsunamis, tidal waves, and at the same time, we're also fascinated, many of us, with predators in nature that are larger than life and rare and exotic, like great white sharks. Well, I would argue that serial killers in many ways are like a tidal wave or a great white shark. They're rare, they're exotic, they're powerful, and they're deadly. And I think that has to do with the fascination as well.
Now, speaking of deadly predators and the like, it was very interesting for me because I think it's a lot of people that study serial killers, the psychiatrists especially, that have studied serial killers have done it on we'll say very limited amount of time in terms of those interviews. Now, tell us about your 2 years with BTK and why BTK, and just tell us a little bit about your correspondence with Bind, Torture, Kill, BTK, Dennis Rader.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I can trace the roots of this book, Why We Love Serial Killers. I can almost trace it back to in many ways, my students. I'm a criminology professor, and what I've noticed over the years is whenever the topic goes to serial killers in the classroom, my students are on the edge of their seats. They just cannot wait. They're practically vibrating in their seats. They're so excited to hear about serial killers. And I realized that there are a lot of people that way, and myself included, who are fascinated by these individuals. And so when I started thinking about this book, I thought about it from the terms of that some of these individuals actually have brand names. If you think about it, Son of Sam, the Night Stalker, Jack the Ripper, BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill, the Night Stalker, as I said, the Boston Strangler. These are almost brand names, and you can actually buy merchandise and products and books and films and games and puzzles that have these names associated with it. And so I said to myself, well, these are commodities. It's pop culture entertainment in many ways. So I decided to go to the source as part of my research, go to Son of Sam and BTK, as you mentioned, and question them. Why did they name themselves? Because those are two individuals who named themselves. Son David Berkowitz called himself Son of Sam, and Dennis Rader called himself Bind, Torture, Kill. So I questioned them, why did you do this? What was the purpose? What did you get out of it? Were you aware of the public's fascination and the fact the public was absorbed in these stories? And so I decided to go to the very source as part of my investigation. And in the case of BTK, he was only too willing to correspond and through the mail with me, and I told him I'm writing a book, and I sort of played Clarice Starling. I said I can learn from you. I can Silence of the Lambs, and so I'd love to question you, and as part of the research for my book. And again, he thinks he's the most interesting fellow in the world, so he was more than happy to cooperate because it feeds his ego. And what I learned is that this is a truly, truly psychopathic, narcissistic individual. The only thing that he really regrets, he sort of gives lip service to the fact that he regrets his murders. I don't believe that he really does. What he really regrets is getting caught. And he likens himself to a natural-born killer, a predator. In fact, he uses analogies like a shark, a hawk, a wolf to describe himself, even to the extent that, Dan, and I think your listeners may find this fascinating, is that he has created his own little logo for himself. His name, Dennis, when he signs his letters, he draws it in the shape of a shark with huge teeth. So he's actually created like his own little prison logo.
Fascinating.
Gives you a sense of the individual.
Yeah, it shows just a sense of the narcissism, too. Now, what were you most surprised? I mean, you're not a guy to be surprised too often with this, but what was, if anything, surprising? Or what did you actually learn that you didn't think you would going in? What were you surprised at learning from Dennis Rader?
Well, BTK, one of the interesting things and fascinating things about him that I learned, and it shocked me at first, but the more that I thought about it, it's very consistent. He's not able to live out his fantasies the way he did on the outside. Serial killers, as you know, their killing is based in fantasy. They fantasize about it in advance. Many of them have a particular type of victim that they're interested in, and as Dennis Rader definitely did, and he called it trolling. He would look for the next perfect victim, and he would seek them out, and he'd watch them, and so forth. Well, he can't fantasize in prison that way any longer. In fact, his media is even screened. They're careful what he is allowed to look at and view because of the fact that it could create an erotic sense of arousal and feed his fantasy needs. So he still fantasizes. He has a need for a fantasy outlet. So what he's done is he's created an investment strategy. He sits in his little 8x10 cell and meticulously follows the stock market and the real estate and commodity markets, and he's created a fantasy investment portfolio that he tracks meticulously all day long, listening to the radio, tracking his investments, and he's proud to boast that he's made a fortune since he's been in prison in 2005. So he's created a fantasy investment portfolio for himself, and that's the way he lives out his fantasy needs now. So it was very surprising, but it's also very consistent with his needs.
Is there a common? I know there's a lot of shared characteristics from serial killers, but at the same time, that's part of the mythology as well, that a profiler can fit them into a nice, tight little slot, and that everybody has the same kind of behavior. But really, as a shared characteristic, how important or not was the idea of reliving the crimes by talking to people like you or people like me or other authors? How important was it to relive? If you didn't have anything left but that, how important was that?
Well, that's also a great question. It is important to say that serial killers are motivated by very, very different things. One of the myths is that it's all about sex. Well, that's just not true. Probably somewhere around 50% or maybe slightly more than 50% of all serial killers are motivated by sex. But sex isn't necessarily even the primary motive there. It might well be the control and domination of the individual that is the primary sense of satisfaction that they get, and sex is really secondary. And they're motivated sometimes by having a mission. There are serial killers who feel the need to rid society of a particular type of individual, prostitutes or homeless people, for example. So some of them are mission oriented. They believe that they've been given some agenda to fulfill. In the case of a BTK, now, he is an individual that is incredibly narcissistic and therefore loves attention. So anything that is going to draw attention to him and put himself in the spotlight is going to feed his ego. And one of the stories that he told me in his letters to me, and I think again that it just shows his narcissism. Dennis Rader, for a while, carried a badge. He was not a law enforcement officer per se, but what he did, he carried a city badge, and he was basically a home inspector for various statutes and compliance. So he could tell you to cut your lawn or keep your dog on a leash, that kind of thing. And he loved it. Of course, that was a power trip for him. Well, because Wichita is, it's a modest-sized city. It's not New York City. Much of City Hall is confined to one or two buildings. So when Dennis Rader went to City Hall to get his badge to be this city compliance officer, guess what he was introduced to? He was shown the BTK war room, where all of the detectives had set up the investigation to track BTK, and they took Dennis Rader in and showed it to him. He said in the letter to me, he said, "What a rush!" with an exclamation point. I mean, that was probably one of the highlights of his life, that moment. Because there he was, basking in the glory of the investigation, thinking to himself, "You fools, you have no idea that it's me."
Yeah, and they had no idea. His veneer was quite good, wasn't it?
Absolutely. For 30 years, he basically was able to avoid the detection and apprehension for 30 years. And the reason that he got caught for your listeners who may not be aware, it was basically his own ego and narcissism that tripped him up. He had been corresponding through the mail with the late Ken Landwehr, the homicide detective who had been tracking him and chasing him for a number of years, and they had developed a bit of a relationship, kind of like Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter, through the mail. And Dennis Rader actually asked Ken Landwehr, "I'm going to send you a floppy disk with some information on it in a letter. You can't trace the information on that, can you?" And Ken Landwehr said, "No, of course not. Please, send that floppy disk right on through." Well, believe it or not, Rader had deleted the address of the church and his name where he was the president of the Lutheran Church Association. So they traced it right to him. And this gets to the fact that Dennis Rader is not a stupid man. He's anything but a stupid man. But in his psychopathic mind, he really believed that he had a relationship with Ken Landwehr, and Ken would never violate that Ken would never betray him. And he was shocked. Dennis Rader was actually shocked that Ken Landwehr would lie to him. So he was undone by his own massive ego.
Well, I don't know if it's always the case, but I know there's a few cases where it's just really testament, I think, to the strategy that the officers, the detectives that are going to interview some of these guys employ, and really attune to that narcissism and get on their side rather than look at them with the kind of disgust that they probably do have, and just become their buddies there for whatever long it takes for these people to really, because they really want to tell someone. They know they're going to have to tell someone.
Well, again, in the case of a BTK, he actually relished when he was finally caught. Once he knew that the jig was up, so to speak, then he was more than happy to sit with the law enforcement officers, and then ultimately in court, he pled guilty to all the murders because he knew the jig was up. But now he got to be the big man on stage once again and say, "Look how I fooled you for 30 years. Look at all the things that I did, and you couldn't catch me. You only caught me because of this floppy disk." And so it fed his ego once again that he was able to basically perform on stage and explain to the world how brilliant he had been for 30 years. So he to get back to your original question, this is an individual who definitely loves the attention in any way that he can possibly get it. But not all serial killers are that way. Not all serial killers crave attention. And Joel Rifkin, for example, who was the most prolific serial killer in the state of New York, was not an attention seeker at all, and in fact, he's another one who was pulled over by in a very sort of unlikely way. He had killed 17 prostitutes, and he had the 17th victim, his 17th prostitute, in the trunk of his car, or excuse me, in the under a tarp in the back of his truck. And he was pulled over for a traffic infraction. His plate had expired. His license plate had expired, and he simply got sloppy and careless. He was driving around with this decomposing body, and the state trooper who pulled him over for the traffic infraction smelled the scent of death. And Joel Rifkin, being a psychopath, however, simply said, "Yes, it's a prostitute. I picked her up in New York City. I had sex with her, but then things went bad, and I had to kill her. Do you think I should get a lawyer?" And of course, the state trooper was completely, dumbfounded by this. But not until they got into the police station and they began to interrogate Rifkin did they even realize that there was a serial killer and that Rifkin was. He ultimately he confessed to the 17 murders. So there really had been under the radar. His work had really been and killings had really been completely under the radar.
Right. Now, what did you learn from Son of Sam Berkowitz? Now, for those that don't know, you could or you can tell the audience if you'd like about the insanity claim. And at the time that you interviewed him, was he clearly sane, or was he still feigning insanity?
Well, David Berkowitz is the son of Sam, has been in prison now for 37 years, and so he's been in prison well over half his life. He's 61 years old, and he's been in prison for 37 years. Now, he was never found insane. He's never been diagnosed as being insane. He's never been on any sort of medication. What I believe about David Berkowitz is that he simply became obsessed with Satan, and I really see it more as almost like a drug addiction. I think killing became a bloodlust and an obsession with him. Now, the thing that is perhaps most fascinating about David Berkowitz is that he is also now a born-again Christian. He became a born-again Christian in prison in, I believe it was either 1986 or 1987, so he had been in prison for about 10 years. And he said that he had a moment of clarity one night where he believed that he couldn't live another day, that he simply wanted to die, and he fell on his knees, and he said that the hand of God touched him, and he has been a different human being ever since then, since 1980, like I said, roughly 1986. And so he now calls himself the Son of Hope. He's no longer Son of Sam, he's the Son of Hope. And what he has been doing since then is he's in the Sullivan Correctional Facility, which is up in the Catskills, in upstate New York. And Sullivan is a facility that is mostly for inmates who are lifers. They're there for life sentences. And many of them would be considered mentally and or physically impaired in some way. And so David Berkowitz actually now helps out the chaplain in the prison church or the prison chapel, and he serves as a mobility guide for some of these prisoners who have problems and so forth. He helps them read, he helps them write letters, and he's been adopted, so to speak, by an evangelical Christian organization outside of the prison that operates a website for him. So he actually has a following. He has a worldwide following of evangelical Christians who have been moved by his expression of remorse and religious conversion. So you can't make this stuff up. He has become somewhat of an evangelist in his own way, and has a following. It's something like 250,000 people have come to his website, in fact.
Well, I have no comment there. What I want to ask is that did you find that he had any real insights into his initial motivation? You talk about Satanism and drugs, but what were his insights into what was going on in his mind at that time?
Okay, sure. Great question. Well, first of all, people ask. Let me start by saying people ask me, do I believe, in his conversion? And I'm going to tell you this. I spent half a day with him, close to 5 hours, and we had lunch together. We sat, we talked, and this is after having, as I said, corresponded for a couple of years. And so I was sitting literally nose to nose with him, and if he's not sincere in terms of his conversion, then he is the Daniel Day-Lewis actor of serial killers, because he literally sat and wept in front of me, with expressing tremendous remorse, and he actually reconciled with the mother of his final victim. His final victim was Stacy Moskowitz, and he actually reconciled with Stacy's mother before she died. They exchanged letters, and she said that she forgave him. She was I don't know if a born-again Christian, but she was a Christian herself. So he actually had some reconciliation there. So it's a fascinating story. I mean, I have an entire chapter devoted of the saga of from Son of Sam to Son of Hope in my book, and it's rather, I just found it rather fascinating. But getting back to your question, Dan, the legend of Son of Sam, the sort of the media created legend, is that he was compelled to kill by by a demonic dog named Harvey that was the dog of his next-door neighbor, Sam Carr, and that somehow this dog, through its nocturnal barkings, would cause him to kill. And there are also parts of the legend that have been presented is that he was part of a cult, part of a killing cult, that he didn't act alone. And I think that these are just complete mythology. That he was not. I do not believe that he was part of a cult, and I do not believe that he believes that a dog was compelling him to kill. What I believe, and this is based upon our conversations, is this: David Berkowitz grew up as a emotionally disturbed, very lonely and isolated young man. And when he was old enough, he enlisted in the military, and he enlisted in the Army, and he told me that he did so to try to find some kind of meaning in his life, some kind of structure and meaning. But he didn't find it. He came out of the Army, he said, more lonely and lost than ever. And it was at this time, at the age of 21, that he started to become interested in the occult and Satan. And he became devoted to Satan. He became a Satan worshiper. And what I think happened is this: he became obsessed with Satan, and he was so lost and so miserable. Somehow in his mind it became twisted, and he felt that by killing for Satan, that somehow he would find purpose and satisfaction and some kind of relief in his life. Now, it's very twisted, but I think that in his mind, that's what he believed at the time. Not mentally ill. It was more of an obsession and a compulsion. It became a bloodlust. But what happened was, as he began to kill, or with each shooting, he was a shooter. He used a Bulldog .44 revolver. Unlike a lot of serial killers who are stranglers or whatever, he shot his victims. No killing gave him any satisfaction. He felt no sense of relief. He felt no sense of closure or satisfaction from his killings. Each one left him feeling more empty than before. So he was compelled to kill again and again and again, searching for some kind of fulfillment, as I said, which never came. And he was ultimately caught in August of 1977, and he told me that he was so obsessed with Satan, in fact, that he thought for the first couple of years while he was at Attica in prison that Satan was going to somehow come and open the door magically his prison and let him out. And, of course, that never happened, and that's when he became despondent, and after almost 10 years in prison, he really wanted to die. And that's when he had his self-proclaimed religious conversion. However, along the way, it's important to also note that he was attacked by another inmate, cut from ear to ear, and I've seen the nasty scar that required approximately 60 stitches, and it's a really nasty scar along his throat. He almost died. He almost bled to death, but they were able to stitch him back together. But they did not do a particularly good job. It's a very nasty scar that he's got.
Well, I want to talk about what you've examined as well in terms of the common myths and a couple of the not-so-common myths about serial killers. What did you find? Mm-hmm. What was one of the more important myths that you've debunked in this book?
Okay. One of the great myths is that serial killers are all men, and that's simply not the case. The serial killers that have become these sort of household names and celebrity monsters, as I call them, are typically men. The Ted Bundys, the Jeffrey Dahmers, et cetera, the BTKs. But throughout recorded history, let's say the last 100 years, about 15%, or at least 15% of all serial killers have been women. We just typically don't know their names. And the one who probably has received the most attention, come to the greatest infamy, would probably be Eileen Wuornos, who was portrayed by Charlize Theron in the Academy Award-winning movie Monster. She did a marvelous job, in that. Mm. So there was some, the massive attention that movie received, Eileen Wuornos is somewhat of a well-known commodity in these circles. But many other female serial killers we simply don't hear about. And one of the reasons, it's the nature of the way that they kill. Female serial killers are motivated by different things than men. Men tend to be motivated by power, control, lust, domination, that sort of thing. Many female serial killers are motivated by what's referred to as either comfort or gain. Oftentimes it's material things. So female serial killers are more likely to be of the Black Widow variety, the ones who stereotypically may be running a rooming house and they prey on their elderly residents, that sort of thing. And a classic example of that was Dorothea Puente out in California, right, she ran a rooming house, and she had elderly house guests there, and she would extort them not extort them, but manipulate them to get their checks, their aids, federal aid checks, and their insurance, and then she would kill them and bury them in the backyard. So she was a predator, Black Widow type. And they just don't receive the same amount of attention that men do, who are killing oftentimes women, but in a more graphic, brutal fashion, and that's what tends to get the media attention. So that's one of the big myths. And another one is that serial killers are all Caucasian, that they're all white, and that's simply not true either. About 20% of all serial killers in the last 100 years have been African American. So they're actually much more proportionate to the population, the makeup of the population. But many of them simply don't become household names. And the one who maybe is the best-known African-American serial killer is the Sunday morning slasher, who preyed back in the early 1980s. But just recently in Gary, Indiana, there has been Darren Vann, who was just captured recently, who was killing African-American prostitutes in Gary, Indiana, and Hammond, Indiana. And here this gets to, it's a rather controversial notion, but I firmly believe this, is the media tends to focus on white male serial killers who are killing white female victims. African-American serial killers who are killing African-American victims simply don't seem to receive the same amount of media attention, although there have been at least 75 to 100 African-American serial killers in the last 100 years.
I've also seen, I think you'd take it even further, and I mean, I think it's just the nature of television itself. If I'm not correct, but you almost see the more handsome killers, mm-hmm. the more handsome victim, the more mm-hmm. innocent a victim, and predominantly, of course, the white victim, but the richer victim and the mm-hmm. more important victim. So if you put that all together, that's just what the media loves. And I don't think it's the public as much as the media itself somehow has decided at some time, and they continue with that.
Well, I understand your point, but it's two sides of the same coin. If the public didn't want to see it, if the public didn't didn't respond, then it would be something else. But yes, most if you think of even beyond serial killers, think about just huge crime cases, trials that we focus on. Almost invariably, there's a very attractive white female victim, and more recently, it's been an attractive white female perpetrator. Think about Jodi Arias or Casey Anthony, an attractive white female perpetrator. So, yes, very frequently there's an attractive white woman involved in the equation somewhere.
Now, you talked about the myth of being all white killers. What's the percentage of killers that are not white, serial killers that are not white, and say the breakdown of Hispanic, 50%. Black, and white?
About 50%, believe it or not, in the last 100 years, only, but about 50% of all serial killers have been white males. Okay, white males. The myth is that they're all white males, but in reality, about 50% have been white males. The other 50% have been people of color and females.
Now, what did you find in your research about profiling itself as a tool? Tell us what some of the things that you've learned.
Oh yeah, well again, a great question. You know, you watch these shows, and admittedly they're very entertaining. You know, the dramatic series, the CSIs, the Law and Order, more recently The Following, and True Detective. All of these shows that are so much fun. You would think that it's an exact science, and you would think that you very quickly draw a profile and you catch a predator, and it's simply not the case. It's actually what I would call an inexact science that is complemented by just a lot of intuition and experiential thinking. And the way that it actually works is quite fascinating. And this dates back to the work of John Douglas, Roy Hazelwood, and Robert Ressler predominantly in the 1970s. What they began to do, and computers aided this, is as these serial predators were captured, they would interview them extensively, and they would create a profile based upon all of the crime scene information, behavioral characteristics, psychological characteristics, everything that was known about the victims, all of the crime scenes, and they would put it into a computer. And they did this initially with about 36 serial predators. And this database since then has just been expanded as more serial killers are apprehended. And the way it works is and I'm sure this is exactly what has happened recently in Gary, Indiana with Darren Vann, is when a serial killer is operating in a local community, the local police don't have the wherewithal, the ability, the tools to profile and to, in a sophisticated way, put together a strategy to capture this individual. So they typically reach out to the FBI. And what happens then is all of the information that's known about this local case, the information from the crime scenes, anything that's known about the victims, are fed into the computer, into this profiler computer, and they attempt to match it up with solved cases. So what you're trying to do is match up an unsolved case where you have a living serial killer on the loose who's unknown, and try to match the characteristics up with solved cases. And that provides a sort of a blueprint for narrowing down the suspect pool, which is what it really does. It helps to narrow down the suspect pool. And one of the more ingenious things that the FBI profilers came up with, and this is the credit here goes to Roy Hazelwood, who I actually who he helped me in tremendously with the research and background for my book. He was very cooperative in terms of an interview with me, and he's given the credit for what's known as the organized versus disorganized dichotomy of serial predators. And what that means for anyone who hasn't heard is, in very broad categories, there tend to be two types of serial killers. There is the absolutely meticulous Ted Bundy type, who plan everything out. They have escape routes. They know what they're going to do with the bodies. They attempt to hide them, etc. Very meticulous. These tend to be the complete psychopaths who are just very cold-blooded. That's one type of serial killer. But then you have the other, or another, who is much more spontaneous, much more impulsive in nature, who just strikes almost like an animal in the wild, and will leave the victim right where they find them. No attempt to hide the body, no attempt to cover up the evidence, and leave what's known as a very disorganized crime scene. Now, the psychological profile and the behavioral profiles of those two types of killers are very, very different. So that's an example of one of the things that they attempt to do. And because not all serial killers are the meticulous Ted Bundy type. Some are very much sort of spontaneous killers. And a classic example of there would be all the way back to our legendary killer Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper would be in that disorganized variety where he just pounced out of the shadows and slashed with a knife and made no attempt to cover up his tracks and just left the body right where it lay.
You speak about Ted Bundy, and in terms of what we could learn from Ted Bundy and what they did learn from Ted Bundy, and in terms of the representation when you're talking about how sometimes fiction and nonfiction really are blurred, those lines. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about Ted Bundy like you do in the book.
Okay. Well, Bundy in many ways is the quintessential serial killer. And what makes him particularly frightening, both compelling and frightening to a lot of people, is he could be anybody. Here's a guy who was very good looking. He was very charming. He was very well educated. He was active in politics. He was basically the young man about town who was people were expecting was going to make big things of himself, and he was actually considered to be quite a catch. He had girlfriends and that he dated who he did not kill, but yet he had this dark side. He had this compartmentalized life where he had this need to prey upon women. And because he was so charming and because he was so unassuming, women would make themselves vulnerable. And one of his typical ploys that he would enact in order to trap them is he would pretend to have an injury, have his arm in a sling or something like that. And people may recall if you watch Silence of the Lambs, that's what Buffalo Bill would do. The character in Silence of the Lambs, he pretended to be injured. Well, they pulled that right from Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy would ask a young woman to help him get into his car or help him bring a package over to his car or something like that. He had a VW Bug, and when they got over to the car, guess what? The front seat, the passenger side front seat was missing. He'd chloroform them and throw them into the car and drive away. But because he was so innocuous or so seemingly innocent that these women would freely go with him. And again, he was a very good-looking guy. So I think he frightens the heck out of us because it's the idea that anyone could be a serial killer. I mean, Ted Bundy could be your next-door neighbor. He could be the guy living down the hall from you. He could be your boss. He could be your employee. He could be anyone. And I think that's particularly frightening to people. And at the same time, these the victims could be anyone because the serial killers tend to have a particular type that is attracted to them, but these are complete strangers. It's not like they're preying on people that they know. And this is also an important myth that I want to debunk. Is there's a myth in society that most murders are committed by complete strangers, that you're likely to be victimized by a complete stranger. And that's absolutely not true. The vast majority of murders are committed among people, by people who know one another. And that's in at least two-thirds of the cases. Now, serial killers, however, completely contradict that pattern of most homicides because they are killing complete strangers. So one of the reasons that serial killers are both fascinating and frightening to us is because virtually anyone could be a serial killer, like a Ted Bundy, and virtually anyone could be a victim. And I think that just keeps us up at night.
You talk also a little bit about Ted Bundy in terms of the the amazing amount of characteristics that are contained in one serial killer. So
Mm-hmm.
it's almost the epitome of a serial killer. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, because that's early on. I think that was even surprising to it was surprising to even the most seasoned veterans. There's only a few people that knew that there was even such a type of creature.
Yeah. The thing that about Ted Bundy is he. It wasn't necessarily about the sex per se. He had a particular type, and the type of woman that he liked tended to have long dark hair, and these were white women, and they actually looked very much like his first girlfriend who had jilted him, which is why he probably targeted women that looked like his first girlfriend. And the insane thing, however, is after he would kill these women, he would have sex with them after they were dead, and he would even go back and have sex with them a long time later, once they were decomposing. So he was a necrophile as well. And it's just so hard to imagine that an individual who seems so charming and seems so normal could be absolutely that twisted. And the indication of his psychopathy, the fact that he was a complete psychopath, was the fact that he would dehumanize his victims. He referred to them as objects, and he explained it. He said, if I humanize them, if I call them by their names, then it's very difficult to do to them what I feel that I need to do to them. So he would just refer to them as objects. And BTK did a very similar thing. He didn't call his victims objects. He called them projects. They were interesting projects for him to work on. And psychopaths like that, those are ways that they are able to rationalize their behavior. These aren't really human beings. These are interesting objects and projects to work with. And because Bundy was such a psychopath, and an important characteristic of a psychopath is their ability to mimic emotion and ability to mimic feelings, even though they don't actually feel them. It's almost like if their empathy cord, if it's like, imagine like an electrical cord in the wall, the ability to connect to another human being is just absolutely pulled out of the wall. They don't have it. They don't have the ability to connect with another human being, which is what enables them to do these horrible things, feel nothing, and also to be very good at it, because they don't have fear. They don't have emotions. They don't have anxiety like the average person does. So therefore, they make very few mistakes, which is what enabled Bundy to kill 36 plus women.
When we're talking about psychopaths, you also talk, I was surprised, and I think this is a bit controversial, but maybe I'll get you to explain. You think there's a genetic predisposition for psychopathology? And
Yes, I do.
And then tell us also how the wires, how you theorize these wires can get severely crossed, and the feelings of murder and sexual desire at an early age.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And once again, Bundy and Dahmer and BTK are great examples here. There's more and more evidence, more and more emerging evidence that the brain of a psychopath simply doesn't work the same way as the average person. They don't process stimuli the same way. They don't process information the same way. It's been shown electrochemically in the way that they do MRIs of the brain and look at how their brains, the synapses fire, and different parts of the brain light up for a psychopath than a normal person. They just process information differently. So imagine, they're just born with a different makeup. They and fortunately, I mean, if there's good news here, it's that a very small percentage of the U.S. population has this psychopathic tendencies. And there's 300 million, roughly, people in the United States, and it's estimated that maybe 1 million have these psychopathic tendencies. And not all psychopaths become killers, and not all killers are psychopaths. And this gets to your question about how, it's triggered. So there are psychopaths who go through their entire lives who never hurt anyone, who never kill anyone, and in fact, sometimes just become extremely successful in whatever endeavor they choose because they are not inhibited by a concern about hurting someone else's feelings or stepping on someone along the way. So you actually have psychopaths who are very successful in business, in politics, in various endeavors because they're just, they don't care whether they hurt other people's feelings. So they don't all become killers. But what appears to happen with a few individuals like BTK and Bundy and Dahmer and others is somewhere around the age of 12 or 13, around the age of puberty, those individuals with this psychopathic pattern or psychopathic tendencies, somehow their sexual interests and fantasies become intertwined with violence, that violence and sex become intermingled to such an extent that they become sexually aroused by violence. And sometimes it's manifested even earlier with dead animals. Like Jeffrey Dahmer talked about finding dead animals along the road, roadkill, and he'd put his hands inside of these animals' dead bodies and would become sexually aroused. One of the more chilling stories that I heard was that of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. He actually witnessed his cousin,
right,
his first cousin, kill his wife in front of him. Richard Ramirez witnessed this. He was around 12 or 13 years old, so in puberty. So he saw his cousin kill his wife, and Richard Ramirez remembers becoming sexually aroused by seeing that happen. So again, what appears to happen is that during puberty, for these individuals with these psychopathic natures, that sex and violence become intertwined, and it becomes then a fixation for them, and they fantasize about it, and it grows until to a point where they need to satisfy it somehow, and that's when they begin the killing process.
But are there conclusive brain scans to indicate that it's genetic, or to determine whether it's environmental or genetic? Is it?
Well, I think it's a combination. My sense is, I'm not a neuroscientist. I have colleagues who study these things, but there's more and more emerging evidence that there is a genetic nature to psychopathy. Then what I think happens, this is where it's the old nature versus nurture. Are they made or are they born? Well, I think it's both. I think that these individuals who have this psychopathic pattern, this chemical or genetic abnormality, are then aroused and triggered when sex and violence become intertwined for them during puberty. So it's a combination of the two. I see it as a combination of of nature and nurture.
Interesting. Now, what is some of the more interesting things that you found in terms of how society responds to serial killers and why?
Great question once again. The serial killers are, as I said, really an entertainment commodity, and what I mean by that is they're products. There are books and movies and games and puzzles and jokes and poems and Jeffrey Dahmer's on just about anything you can possibly imagine, and as such, they really fall into that entertainment commodity until it strikes the individual. When if a serial killer is responsible for taking your sister or someone in your family, it becomes real. But until then, it's a form of entertainment. And I've actually had people describe it to me as a guilty pleasure. It's almost like eating the extra candy bar or the having an extra serving of ice cream. And people are not even sure entirely why they're so fascinated by these things. It's almost like you see an accident on the side of the road, and you feel compelled to look at it, but you're not even sure why. It's just this sort of morbid fascination. And I think that serial killers fall into that category for a lot of people. And we can't deny the visceral aspect of it. There's a visceral appeal. There's the adrenaline rush that we get from these things, and that goes all the way back to childhood. We love boogeymen and monster movies, and being frightened by Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers on Halloween. Well, serial killers are for adults. In many ways, what monster movies are for children. And I think that there's this tendency to, on the one hand, humanize these individuals. We want to try to understand what could compel someone to do these horrible things, but then simultaneously there's also a need to try to dehumanize them, turn them into monsters, so that that they become the other. They become the thing that we don't really need to understand. They're boogeymen. They're just monsters, so we don't really need to understand them. So there's sort of a push and a pull. We feel the need to understand them, but we can't because they're just too incomprehensible. So what do? We turn them into these sort of larger-than-life monsters and boogeymen.
Do the true crime stories inform the fictional stories, which may then influence killers who may influence other killers? What I'm asking is, are killers competitive? Do they see each other as in a competition? And do they look to fiction from your research or true crime stories? Do they look to all that? They're part of that. But how affected are they by what we might see as a competition between serial killers?
Well, that's also a great question, and I would not go as far to say that true crime stories or anything like that inspire people to do something that they're not already going to do. Right? Someone doesn't become a serial killer just because they read about BTK or Jeffrey Dahmer. That doesn't happen. No. But in my experience, they are students of the game, and they do study each other. In fact, the ones who are incredibly narcissistic, they will find ways of making themselves feel superior to others. For example, in my correspondence with BTK, I mentioned to him that I was also corresponding with David Berkowitz, with Son of Sam. Well, in BTK's own way, he sort of put Berkowitz down by insinuating, well, he shot. He used a gun. He didn't really want to get his hands dirty, so he's not really a serial killer, So there is a sense of competition, and another one of the sort of myths that's associated with these folks is that they're all cops. As soon as a serial killer is on the loose, they assume that that it's a former detective or something like that. But the reality is these guys tend to study police work because it makes them better killers. If they're familiar with how long it takes a 911 call to be responded to, for example, it's only going to make them that much better at what they do. So the vast majority of these guys are not cops, but they tend to be very familiar with policing practices and activities. And in fact, BTK actually has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. So he was very interested in this stuff.
And it seems, too, that there's been a development that the guys that thought they could burn all of the evidence now with DNA especially, it seems that some people are learning about disposal techniques as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So, you have to look at it this way. To be as prolific as some of these individuals are, killing 10, 20, 30, 40 people, you have to know what you're doing. And these individuals are obsessed. They're compulsive. They are absolutely driven to do this. And BTK actually had a name for it. He came up with a term for his compulsion or his motivation, and he called it Factor X. And Factor X was basically what it is. It was this overwhelming desire that he didn't really understand. I really don't think that Dennis Rader understands the compulsion. He knows when he felt it. He knows when he had to go out and kill, but he couldn't really understand it, so he gave it a name. He called it Factor X. And you asked me earlier one of the more shocking things about him, and this pretty well would sum it up. He, in his pathological mind, actually thinks that society should be grateful that he learned how to satisfy himself through autoerotic fantasy. He would keep the trophies and souvenirs and relive his crimes in the privacy of his basement with dolls and so forth that he would pretend to strangle and then sexually please himself. And he said by doing that, I was able to delay and put off having to kill another victim. So I guess he thinks that we should feel grateful to him in some way, and which gives you a further indication of his maniacal and narcissistic mind. Yes.
Now, you talked about what I found interesting, and I agree with you totally too, is that you talked that irrespective of any deceptively benign appearances to the contrary, and again, not appearances, but even appearances meaning extensive interviews, they are never like us. And when you talked about psychopathology, I just want to get to this issue, and I just want to put this out there, I think, is that what's interesting is that the psychiatric community has now, Robert Hare has come and popularized this idea that there are a lot of psychopaths. It's still rare, but there's a fair amount of psychopaths, but almost no psychopaths kill. There's just, even that's rare that the psychopathic mind can be a psychopathic killer. But what I find is that isn't that sort of normalizing and excusing, again, if you're going to say genetic predisposition or genetic is a big component, and then environment, and I'm up in Canada, so these aren't mitigating circumstances. This can get you walking out the door sometimes. So nurture was bad, your environment was bad, genetic predisposition, dad was in prison, and 12 years old, he saw some slasher movies or was exposed to like Ramirez something. Isn't this on the pathway of some kind of excuse? Or, as opposed to what you're saying is that them are never the same as us, isn't it sort of getting us close to that? They're a psychopath at work, and a psychopath may be your boss, but then if the right factors are there at 12 or 13 years of age, anything can happen?
Yeah, I understand your question. I can't comment on Canadian criminal law, but I can on U.S. criminal law. The psychopaths, first of all, psychopathy, and for that matter, sociopathy, does not constitute mental illness in the U.S. Criminal justice system. These individuals who are psychopaths or sociopaths, they're considered antisocial personality disorders, and they're not mental illness. It's not like schizophrenia or psychosis, where people see visions and they're out of touch with reality. In fact, somebody like a Dennis Rader or a Ted Bundy are acutely aware of what they're doing. They know that what they're doing is wrong. They absolutely know that murder is wrong, which is the definition of sanity or insanity in the U.S. criminal justice system. The only way you are insane criminally is if you didn't know that it was wrong at the exact moment that you did it. Not 5 minutes before, not 5 minutes later, at the exact moment you did it. Which is why these individuals almost never are able to use the insanity defense, because they simply don't. It doesn't apply. They knew it was wrong. They just don't care. They were going to kill, and they were determined to kill, and they don't care whether it was right or wrong. So from a very practical standpoint, psychopaths they do not benefit in any way from the insanity defense.
No, I understand that issue. I'm just saying it's sort of society-wise, we've turned the psychopath into the sociopath and sort of normalized it to a certain degree in that, oh, well, geez, your boss is a psychopath, but it doesn't mean he could be a killer. In that conflicts with, them or not us. And that's what I really truly believe is that irrespective of everything, I really do believe that that's what the fascination is for me, and I think for a lot of people, in that we do not see ourselves in these people at all. And that's what's fascinating about them. We don't share any of these characteristics, these impulses, these compulsions, these fantasies. So that's just my take on it.
Well, I think my research, and this is talking to both investigators, detectives, as well as the general public, there's a bit of it gets us to question, what might I do? Could I ever do these sort of things? And so I one of the arguments that I make in my book is that serial killers sort of define the outer realm of humanity, what one human can do to another. They sort of delineate the distinction between man and monster. And, what Ted Bundy did after capturing, torturing, mutilating, killing, necrophilia, what's left? There's just nothing left, really, that one human being can do to another. And so they sort of really are that distinction between human and monster, and they serve a purpose to the extent that they remind us that we're not them, and thank God. I might not always be the best parent, I might not always be the best husband or boyfriend, but I'm not killing and eating people, and so they do set that boundary and serve a purpose to that end. But at the same time, I think we are compelled to understand them. We are compelled to try to understand why they would do these absolutely horrible things, and as such, it gets us to think about human nature, to a certain extent. Because, like it or not, these aren't monsters. That's the whole point of my book. These aren't boogeymen. They're not Michael Myers. They're not Freddy Krueger. They are human beings who just happen to be doing very, very horrible things.
Yeah, it's very interesting too that you have a vivid portrayal too of Sam, the son of Sam Berkowitz, David Berkowitz, in his transformation. Like you say, unless he's the Daniel Day-Lewis of con men, then has been some dramatic and profound transformation. So to really show the humanity that what can happen in 25 years, even for diehards like me that figure to lock them up and leave them there, that at least that there is a huge difference between what the media portrayed him, and he went along with it as well. The photographs of him seem, it's almost like a very demonish, but sort of childlike in sort of a way too. But a lot of these guys have never had that kind of attention, so maybe it's kind of natural as well that they would feed into that. So.
Well, he told me he was very aware. He told me he was very, very aware of what he was doing at the time, and he wanted to terrorize the city. The so-called Summer of Sam, 1977. He held New York City completely hostage, and he loved it. Because here's a guy who had basically been, very insecure and lost as a young man, and now he's got an entire city at his beck and call, so to speak. And it certainly he got off on it, without a doubt. But I'm very practical, I guess I would say, and pragmatic in terms of my reaction to David Berkowitz. I was moved, I have to say, as he sat and wept in front of me as he talked about his the remorse he had. I was moved by the experience. But from a very practical standpoint, if he's doing some positive things behind bars and corresponding around the world with cancer patients and all the things that he's doing, and if even one person feels better and gets some sort of relief from what he's doing and their life is better for it, then I'd say let him continue. You know, he's not going anywhere. He's never getting out of prison, and he knows he's never getting out of prison. So you know, let him continue to do it.
Well, there's a whole lot of redemption available, I'm sure. Now, you make the case that, you know, not to be anti-death penalty, but you state the case that it's very important to interview these type of people, and that really is testament in your book with BTK and David Berkowitz, in that it's very important to be able to speak to these people, that profiling has been very important and a useful tool, despite it not being as good as Criminal Minds on television. But so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, these individuals are, I mean, fortunately they are rare, and they are extreme in what they do. But as such, it's important to talk to them and to get an understanding of their motivations and you know, what compelled them, because that's what leads to apprehension in the future. I mean, that is part of the profiling process, is that to understand a Ted Bundy, to understand a BTK, enables law enforcement to be that much better prepared to catch the next one, because this is they're not going away. You know, they're these individuals. The good news is in the United States, at least, homicide is going down, and it's gone down precipitously since the 1990s. There, in the peak year of homicide in the United States was 1993. And last year it was less than 15,000 murders. In 1993 it was almost 25,000 murders. So it's gone down tremendously. And serial killing has gone down proportionately as well. Serial killers, here's another myth. People think that serial killers are responsible for a much higher percentage of all murders than they are, and that's just not the case. It's about 1% in the United States of all homicides are a result of serial killers, just 1%. So it's a fraction, but because of the disproportionate amount of media attention that they get, it seems like they're responsible for a lot more.
Is it a myth that we know there's more serial murderers in America than other countries, even if it's proportionally? But how much are we talking about? Just a little bit. What's the actual facts?
Well,
about?
There's serial killers all over the world. I mean, there was one just recently in Brazil who apparently is one of the most prolific serial killers of the last 100 years. So they exist all over the world. They just don't get the same level of media attention as they do in the United States. And the statistics, the data, is not as readily available in other countries. There are serial killers everywhere. There are serial killers in Russia, in China, in Iran, in Canada. You know, obviously, but they just don't receive the same amount of attention that they do in the United States. So serial killers are not an American, a purely American phenomenon. That's another myth. It has to do with the nature of the media market in the United States, and the fact that the United States is the media capital of the world.
How much of an influence does Hollywood have in this as well? Because the American film industry really is the biggest other than Bollywood, so other countries have a healthy film industry. But how important is that, and how much does that kind of dictate things?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, serial killers have become absolutely one of the prime commodities in the film industry. The girl who played with fire, the girl with the dragon tattoo. I mean, this is a worldwide sensation. There was a TV series very popular. The Following Hannibal, based upon the early years of Hannibal Lecter, True Detective.
Dexter.
So you've got Dexter. You've got the TV shows. You've got film. So the media absolutely are responsible in many ways for keeping serial killers on the horizon and making the public think that they're much more prevalent and much more responsible for the homicide problems than they really are. And also the media, and it's not just the entertainment media, fictional entertainment media, it's the news media that do the same thing in terms of turning them into these sort of larger-than-life boogeymen, by the very nature of the description. I mean, you pick up an article in virtually any newspaper, and I'm not talking about the sort of the tabloid, sensationalized newspapers, any newspaper, the New York Times, the London Times, and if there's a serial killer, almost invariably in the first paragraph, you'll see the words evil, monster, devil, vampire. They're going to be right there, and those terms are inhuman terms to describe something, larger than life and, like I said, like a Dracula character.
Now, what seems to be more popular, or at least not more popular, but more prevalent, and of course then the attention of the media is focused on it, is mass murder as opposed to serial killing. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of supplanting one from the other?
Well, you bring up a very fascinating point. In the United States, there's a very interesting thing happening, and tragic. And actually, it's not just the United States; it's worldwide. The homicide rate is going down tremendously, but the suicide rate is going way up. In the United States, we have basically an all-time low in homicide in at least in the last 50 years, whereas we have an all-time high in suicide, and they're going in opposite directions. There's almost 3 suicides for every murder now in the United States. But to get to your question, the one area of murder where there's a dramatic increase in the United States is mass murder, not serial murder, mass murder, and that's the one-offs, the Virginia Techs, the Columbines, the Aurora, Colorado, James Holmes, movie theater massacre. Those have gone up dramatically in the last 7 to 10 years. So that is is the one aberration to the whole thing, and this may well be the focus of a future book. If you think about the motivations for mass murder, they're very different than serial murder. Serial killers kill because they love it, they're addicted to it, they need to do it. Mass murderers are typically nihilistic, fatalistic individuals who have a vendetta against some group who they think has some grievance, and they have no exit strategy. Typically, they're killed at the scene of the crime, many times when they turn the gun on themselves. So they have no intention to live another day. So it's interesting that it's suicide and mass murder that are on the increase in the United States, and the two are very much intertwined. So I think that's a very fascinating thing.
What are the trends in terms of disturbing in terms of familicide and like the killing of a family and then murder-suicide?
Yeah, well, that's part of the whole thing. That's part of this of this process. Oftentimes, as soon as there's something horrible, like someone shoots their family and then turns the gun on themselves, immediately the public says, why didn't he just kill himself? Why did he have to kill his entire family? Well, I've been doing some research into this and talking to a lot of people, even people who are have some suicidal thoughts themselves, and the way that, and again, people who do something like this, obviously they're not in the right mind when they do it, but what keeps people who may have suicidal tendencies sometimes from actually acting out on it is for fear and the concern about what would happen to their loved ones if they kill themselves. And therefore, in a very perverse but kind of logical way, sometimes people will say, well, if I kill my entire family, then they won't be left to worry about me. So if I kill them first, then I can turn the gun on myself and kill myself, which is what I really want to do. So granted, it's a very perverse logic, but to someone who's very disturbed, there's a certain internal logic to that. And so the goal, I don't think, in some of those cases is really to kill the family. The goal is to kill themselves, but they do it to relieve themselves of the guilt of leaving people behind.
Now, in terms of why we love serial killers, you talked about the murder rate going down and the media and probably the public's attention focusing elsewhere. Is there really an abatement to the fascination to serial killers? If you looked at the last 50 years, is there any let up? I mean, Hollywood has got serial killer woven into every television series or movies, but do you see any kind of slowdown or focus towards something else? Or is there something about serial killers and their representation of evil and our representation of good conquering evil in a very, as you said, oversimplified way? Are we always going to be loving serial killers is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I understand your question, and I certainly don't see any let up. If anything, they're more popular in the entertainment media right now. Again, we rattled off some of the shows that are Dexter, which recently was completed, but True Detective, which was just on last season. The following, Hannibal. There was several BBC shows that focus on serial killing. So I don't think that the interest is going away at all, and I think it's a rather timeless thing. It's, again, to the extent that we turn them into monsters, there's always been a fascination with monsters, and you mentioned the whole good versus evil. Well, how different really is Ken Landwehr, the detective chasing BTK in reality for years? How different is that than Dr. Van Helsing chasing Dracula? It's very it's similar. They're morality plays. They're morality dramas, good versus evil, and we love those good versus evil stories.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Scott, I'd like to thank you very much for this interview. For those that might want to contact you, how do you do that? Do you do the Facebook, and do you have a website? Tell us how people might be able to contact you.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, on Twitter, my Twitter handle is @DocBonn, and that's DocBonn. I have a Doc Bonn page, again, DocBonn on Facebook, and I also have a Doc Bonn website, and it's docbonn.com, and that my website is just packed with information on serial killers and crime in general, and a lot of articles I've written. I also have a blog. I do a almost weekly blog on psychologytoday.com, and the name of my blog is Wicked Deeds, WICKED, Wicked Deeds, DEEDS, and so I invite people to check that out. I've written a lot of articles about psychopaths, sociopaths, and serial killers, and many other things as well. And and I certainly invite your listeners. Hopefully, they'll check out my new book, Why We Love Serial Killers: The Curious Appeal of the World's Most Savage Murderers. And it's pretty much available everywhere: Barnes & Noble in store, and online, which is maybe most convenient at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, indie books, and should be available, readily available. So I invite people to check it out.
Yeah, I want to thank you very much. It's we've had a great conversation. It was really nice speaking with you, and I hope to hear from you again soon. I know you're a prolific writer, and I'm sure you've got another book in the works, no doubt. So I want to thank you very much, and you have a great evening. Thank you.
My pleasure, and thank you so much for having me on the show.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Okay, bye-bye.